Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right. And we're seeing that, again, proven out every day of the week at every level of governance. And yes, this is Tom Nabolis, your host, and I am so delighted to be here with you again. It's always a wonderful opportunity to sit and share those mirrors of history in one way or another with you, and to just kind of bring to you some of the truth, the reality, the facts as I am able to discern them, uncover them, read about them, so that you can have the fundamentals upon which to understand and develop your ideas of governance, both self-governance and in general governance overall. I have titled this week's program, The Law, question mark, and man's law or God's law. And that's what it really comes down to. I was reminded of that in a very good, once again, teaching as I see it by Pastor Wilson, in that he has a series going on, and you can see it on YouTube. The link is down below in the YouTube. Those that are watching this or go to this on YouTube and follow the program in the archives. Again, you can find the archives at samueladamsreturns.net, and there you can hear the archive of the audio of the program, as well as you can go to the video of the program there on YouTube. So with that, and it was in the promo, so you can go back to the promo if you received the promo. If you don't get the promo, please sign up at samueladamsreturns.net and get on the mailing list so you know on Friday what Saturday's program is going to be about. With that, you'll see in those archives and on the promo, if you received it, Pastor Wilson's new message that he's doing is God wrote a book. And that's part one of God wrote a book. Now, when I was looking at the fact that he wrote this book, and the book is the living word then being Jesus Christ, and what all of that means, it comes down to, where do we substantiate the idea of law? Where does that come from? And what we're seeing, especially at the federal level, is that we're seeing this lawlessness that is happening within the halls of governance. Interesting. We're seeing lawlessness in the place that law should be developed in such a manner that it is the exercise of how governance functions within the context of our republic. So we can look at a book written by a man by the name of Bastiat, and I'm going to give, or I should say, there is the link to that, and I'm making some additional notes for myself on certain things, is that with Bastiat, he wrote a book called The Law. Very, very good, short book. Many people refer to it. Most of those, especially the Democrats, would prefer not to refer to it or to even look at it, because it points out exactly what we're seeing them do is lawlessness, and that the law is being taken advantage of by those with some kind of personal agenda instead of what it is for the greater good. But when we look at that, the idea of where does law come from, one of the other references that you'll have to go there is the organization that I talked to you about before too, is the Lownang Institute, which means the Law of Nature and Nature's God Institute, Lownang Institute. And one of the critical components that I'm looking at for that is the legal foundations, the framework of law. What I mentioned to you last week is that I can clearly understand why many of the, especially the liberal denominations, do not preach from the Old Testament. They don't recognize the value of the Old Testament. And even many of the more conservative evangelicals do not refer to the Old Testament is because there is a framework for law. And there is the wonders of grace, there is the actions of grace, but then if you minimize those words in the Old Testament and do not reflect upon them from an establishment of fundamentals, then you're actually rejecting the Word, and you're rejecting the Word if the Word is Jesus Christ, as we are told both in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament, in the Gospel by Paul, so on. You go look those references up. But if we reject the whole or portions of the Word, logic would assume that you're rejecting the Word because of the continuity across all of that. So, in the first order of today's program, I would recommend going to look at and watch that teaching on, God established a book. He wrote a book, and that book is a book that establishes fundamental principles right from the very beginning. And then what we have to have for any sense of governance, whether it's self-governance or whether or not it is a local government, then we have to look at where's that framework come from. In the references also, so we're covering all the references up front here a little bit, but in the references also, there is included a sermon by Timothy Dwight. Timothy Dwight is one of the pastors that I talk about, and he is the grandson of Jonathan Edwards. His brother was a lawyer, Theodore Dwight, but you can read about Timothy Dwight also in the Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution. So he's there. But he wrote a sermon that was given on the 7th of July in 1795. It was given before the Connecticut Society of Cincinnati. Connecticut Society of Cincinnati. I don't know if there's too many C's or S's in there, but it all comes out that it was in New Haven, Connecticut in 1795. And the title of it ties in with governance, ties in with constitutionalism, ties into what everybody is whining about right now. And it's not the impeachment. It's about happiness. How do we have a happy public? The happiness of the public. So the title is The True Means of Establishing Public Happiness. Very interesting sermon. You're going to have to delve into the deeper portions of it. I'll cover some of it today during the segments. But where I want to begin is that when we look at how we tie constitutionalism together, and when we look at law in relationship to a framework of governance, and how then is that interpreted to ensure that whatever a legislative body puts together and what they decree by virtue of them being representatives of the people, making it a Republican form of government, and I'm not talking about the Republican Party, a Republican form of government, a representative form of government. We have to understand then, how do we interpret those articles within a constitution? How do we interpret the validation of law based on principles, and is that law established for what purpose? And the purposes most often are, when we look at the general theory of society coming together from a foundational perspective. Modern theorists, modern sociologists, modern, whatever you want to call modern, has in so many instances perverted the ideas of association. Why do we associate within the context of a society? And then that gets into how do you govern? You know, we're moving back to the only ones that understand how to govern are the intelligentsia, which I bring up. I've talked to you often about what Thomas Sowell has written about that as well. So as we're coming closer to a close of this first segment, how quickly time goes by, I am going to drive you heavily back to the references. And what I appreciate about one of the talking points in what Pastor Wilson has in there is that you can't be an island when it comes to understanding the scriptures. You need to have references. You need to understand who those founders were. You need to understand the likes of Augustine. You need to understand Calvin. You need to understand other reformers to grasp, especially in the context of what is going on in the Protestant movement, and hold on to and be able to review what were those thought processes. And not, I think because I'm a purist in all of this, as a Puritan, as I talked about in the last program, is that the idea that is happening in modern times, as we saw heartbreaking, is that Chick-fil-A capitulated to the demands of perversion. And we need people that understand the law. And that's why I put a big question mark. The law? What is it? And is it man's law and man's pressure? Is it man's determination of how we're supposed to act, what we're supposed to do? Or is it God's law and God's mind, his determination? So it comes down to what I talked about a little bit last week. What's your eschatology? How do you view the end times? Do you self-prophesy, self-fulfill the prophecy of persecution? Because all you look at is that the first church got persecuted, but do you understand how and why and the historical context of that? Do you understand the reality more so which they understood as they were resisting the perversions of secular government? That's the reason their persecution came, is because they were resisting all of that and understanding that the King of Kings reigns over all, and that his message was to go out and teach and to bring these truths to bear, so that we would have eventually the idea of an America, that we would eventually have an idea of not a God's kingdom on earth, but of earth being consumed by God's kingdom. I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the twists. And we're going to go into, in the next segment, from Joseph's story just a little bit, because there's things I like about Joseph's story, and there's things that I go, oops, and I raise the old eyebrow, as Kath would say, on how to properly interpret the Constitution. And that goes in the same context as we look at what does it mean when we evaluate and we go through understanding of Scripture. Where is it in its historical context? Where is it in its word context? Where is it in that whole perspective of knowing that biblically the Bible is the Word of God, the living Word of God, Jesus Christ himself, in that euphemism. Whereas constitutionalism is something that Sam Adams clearly understood, and he and the Anti-Federalists absolutely warned of where we would be today if we do not understand and maintain those fundamentals of truth. Come on back in the next segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. Got it right. This is Tom Navolis, your host. And you know what? I'm so thankful to Liberty Works Radio Network for having me on, and those with, Soaring Eagle Radio. When you get to the first and third segments, they get that piece of it. But you here at Liberty Works Radio Network, you are so special that you get to hear the whole program. But in hearing that whole program, it's important for you to participate. So as I always ask in this segment, is that you check out that live programming if you're in the local markets within that Maryland and other local markets, that you would listen to that live programming, as well as all of you that listen to the program on the internet. Go to libertyworksradionetwork.com or lwrn.net and check it out. Hear what's going on. And then there is that button there. Hit that donate button. Thank you. You'll be very, very pleased to know that you, as a listener, keep this program on the air. And the whole network as well. So with that, we're going to jump right back over and we're going to talk a little bit more about Timothy Dwight and what was going on with him in this sermon. And this sermon is the means of establishing public happiness. And he took as his text Isaiah 33:6. And wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of thy times. Boy, we sure could use some of that, can't we? Isn't that important if we would have that? And what I am bringing this into the context of the program from that historical basis as to what it means from governance and all of that, is that just in these two paragraphs, and then I'm going to jump on to other stuff, but in these two paragraphs, he goes, to establish on firm foundations the happiness of society is evidently one of the most important concerns of man. If the attainment of that happiness be highly desirable, the perpetuation of it must be more desirable. Its daily value is daily renewed during its circumstance, and when extended through a century, it is mathematically proved to be of 100 times the value which it would possess if extended only through a year. The mind of man, instinctively realizing this truth, has ever labored rather to secure than to obtain happiness, both public and private. The attainment is usually not a difficult task, the establishment a Herculean one. A free government has been always and justly supposed to be a primary source of national happiness. To form such a government has been found sufficiently easy, but to render it durable has been ever considered as a problem of very difficult solution. Yet, in its durability plainly consists almost all the value of such a government. Hence, most of the political knowledge and labor of freemen has been employed and exhausted in endeavoring to give stability to their respective political systems. Hence, have arisen the numerous checks and balances and divisions of power and influence found in our own political constitutions and in those of several other nations. In other nations, these means have been generally insufficient to accomplish the end. Whether they will ensue more happily in our own is uncertain. In several instances, we seem to have approached the verge of dissolution, but we have providentially withdrawn before the season of safety was past. Men of extensive political information and sagacious forecast have frequently trembled for our national existence, and notwithstanding some favorable interpositions of Providence in our behalf, they still wait anxiously to know what the end will be. Should we fall, the fairest hopes of wise and good men will be blasted. The maximum that mankind cannot be governed without force and violence will stand on higher proof and be advanced with new and triumphant confidence, and the great body of civilized men will probably sit down in sullen and melancholy conviction that nations cannot, unless circumscribed by Alps or oceans, be permanently free. I would suggest that you continue on in reading this, because in so many ways, I think just those opening paragraphs establishes or the question of one's mind for what is occurring right now in our national government. And to some extent, when we look at it in the various states across this nation that have the left, socialist, communist in the state houses and in the governorships, people are so easily duped into being misled from what that understanding of true happiness is, that they think that government in and of itself can determine what it is to provide for their happiness, whether that's a cell phone, free cell phones, free cash, Obama phones, Obama cash, free cars, Obama cars, those types of things, which are all socialism and we know fails. It does not make people happy. I was talking to a friend of mine from my old military days this past week, and we were talking about the differences of what is across this world, because we have seen many different things across the world in the numbers of countries that we've had the opportunity of visiting during our military time and even other after that. We talked in particular about the country of Georgia, because he has spent some time there, and in that, the average annual income of the people in the country of Georgia is $500 a month. So take 500 times 12 is what? You do the math, $6,000 a year, and we can't get by in the most cases on $60,000 a year. So you go from $500 a month. Yeah, that comes out to about $6,000 a year if you know how to do your math. But the people are happy. The people have their needs. And you can use all your economic and geo blah, 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 whatever excuses about, the cost of living, blah, 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 all of that. No. The people have understood and they know what Sam Adams was talking about, removing the frivolity of life. And when you remove the frivolity of life, your happiness has to be derived by something else. And government cannot provide that happiness. And that's where what we have with Timothy Dwight ultimately comes to that conclusion for every person. And the idea of what it means within the context of governing, self-governing, and government in and of itself, is that when you look at the plethora of frivolity that we have, the marketing magnets that are coming after you, drawing you polarity in so many different directions, is that where do you derive your happiness? And the psychobabble that's out there is you can't derive your happiness from self-affirmation. No, you can't do it from there. The only place to get your happiness and understand that is how you as an individual are in relationship with the living God that created you. And when you're in relationship with the living God that created you, and you understand that he has established the fundamentals of law for you to live within, and not to beat you over the head with it, but to give you a framework for your happiness. To give you that framework by which you can take and live within all of the realm of his creation. It's that simple. It is really that simple. So when we look at what is a just society, what provides for that, as Dr. Dwight takes and summarizes in the end of just that second paragraph, that if we cannot have that within the context of a society and a government and a system that understands the values of that balance that are provided by divine providence, we will see those separations. We saw that afterwards in the Civil War. We're seeing it now because we have walked away from the whole perspective of what gives us happiness in relationship to God and man, even from the very fundamentals of the Ten Commandments. I always say that if you want to take and get the shootings out of the school, if you want to get the suicides out of the school, you need to put the Ten Commandments back in the hallways of the school. You need to put the Ten Commandments back in the courtrooms. You need to bring those fundamentals right back into society. So go through that. Go ahead and take a look at what's there in that sermon. And I'll tell you, he does a great job of just bringing us all together just in that alone. Then that brings us back into Loning. And what is the framework of law? Well, you got to go to a source. Where does law come from? And, when you're looking at that, we see that it has both a historical and biblical perspective, and you can't detach them. When you detach them, and man becomes the purveyor of all that is fundamental and establishes a self-prophesying framework, if you will, then you get Venezuela, then you get East Germany, then you get communist Russia, then you get the transitions of what is happening down in Chile. Then you see what's happening in the Middle East. Then you see what is happening all over the globe in Europe. And yes, you see what's happening in your own community, and you see what's happening in America in general. Because I guarantee you that Adam Shifty has no use for God's law whatsoever. Nor does Nancy Pelosi. Nor do any of those, even the Republicans, that are taking and establishing the insanities that they do that go against even the laws of nature. And natural law is a derivative of God's law. It's imperative that we understand that as we look at how to take and develop through what is just common sense ideas of right and wrong, and then not having a framework upon which we are taking and bringing to bear how society should function, we end up with the perversions. We end up with Chick-fil-A taking and giving in, becoming the tolerant that they are. And I, quite frankly, Kath made a comment this morning saying, you know what? We don't go to Chick-fil-A very often, but I'm never going again. How is it that they could give in? Again, it all depends on what the pressures are, what changed. It depends on how they view their position in biblical kingdom reality. And if they think they're whatever they think, we don't know what they think, but the fact of the matter is you can't capitulate to evil, because every time you do, then, next step is now they want Chick-fil-A to give up all of their Christian values. That's the next step. That's what they're pushing for now. How about you? Where are you at? Are you understanding what this means from the idea of where do you derive your happiness from? Where do you derive the idea of self-governance from? The idea of law, of how you govern within your home, how you govern within your community, how society should function and govern within the context of what is just, what is right, and what drives to happiness, Sam Adams understood it. And we're going to get into talk about Justice Story and his interpretation of the Constitution in the last segment. Come on back. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they did. They absolutely got it right. And yes, this is Tom Navulis, your host. There's one pitch I want to give you today, especially for all of those in Ohio. And I just want to remind you that if you're looking for some Christmas gifts, if you're looking for something that's unique and flavorful, if you want a culinary experience, you need to go to pepper-licious.com. And that's in the promo as well as it is in the archives at samueladamsreturns.net. Now, Pepperlicious is taking and helping support what we do because Kath and I own the company. So when you help us with Pepperlicious and buy our jams and our hot pepper powders and that, what you're doing is helping us keep this program going because you know what? We self-fund this thing right now. We don't get any money from anybody else unless you take and you buy some of my books. So it's really helpful that if you take and go to pepper-licious.com, you can get some nice ideas for gift packs, especially after December 8th. We'll have some available, but you can buy those gifts of our hot pepper jams for your culinary experience to share now, especially cranberry pineapple is fantastic with turkey or any of those other Thanksgiving type meals that you're about to have. So I ask you to help and do that. But yeah, we're an Ohio-based company, so really only those in Ohio can buy from us. Again, it's pepper-licious.com. Check it out in the references. So let's jump ahead and jump back now into Joseph's story, Justice Joseph's story in his notes from his commentaries on the Constitution. He does a whole section here on the rules, get this, rules of constitutional interpretation. And before I forget, hey, all of you folks there from Soaring Eagle, welcome back into segment number 3. Really appreciate Dr. Spalding having my program on that radio station. As well as I always say, hey, first to the deal is Liberty Works Radio Network. So Joseph's story in 1833, as he was going through and writing his commentaries, as I say in my book, as well as you've heard me say on this programming, is that the interpretation of the Constitution started getting squirreled up right from day one. And we saw that in a number of different court cases, and we saw that in how Congress began to act. We saw that in the first national bank debate. We saw that in what was happening between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and what happened in Mayberry Madison, and we saw on and on and on and on it went until here we are, 1833, and we have Story taking and trying to clear some of the fog, and that fog is even getting thicker as we move 30 years out into the period of the Civil War. It's like, wow. And now you come to today, and you sit there and you go, how are these people interpreting the Constitution? Well, first off, I don't think the legislators are. I think that these whack job, I don't care, Republican or Democrat, I think the punks that they have as attorneys that are out there writing all of this legislation and the junk coming out of the think tanks is not anything that goes down to the fundamentals of law, as we talked about in the first 2 segments, and the fundamentals of how to interpret the Constitution. So I think this is a good study for you. It's only 44 pages long in this section, and it's there in the references. Once again, But Joseph Story talks about the rules of interpretation. And he starts out, in our future commentaries upon the Constitution, when we shall treat it then as it is denominated in the instrument itself as a constitution of government. So first off, define what it is. Define it. A constitution of government ordained and established by the people of the United States for themselves and their posterity. Geez, let's see. That's in the preamble, if I think. So once again, this Constitution was, although the arguments go established by the for and by the states, it was not necessarily that, as it was argued during the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, it was actually established by the people through representation and the fact that it's the supreme law of the land. And just jumping through, because there's so much to cover, just so much, and I don't have the time. I can lecture on this thing for probably a month, and the problem is that we have Supreme Court justices that understand this, and then we have those that are the liberals on the bench who have glossed over this and are talked about actually by Joseph Story in the very beginning of this segment. Actually, as he talks about in paragraph 179, in this view of the matter, let's now proceed to consider the rules by which it ought to be interpreted. For if these rules are correctly laid down, it will save us many embarrassments in examining and defining its powers. Boy, we see so much of that with all these different court cases that go before the Supreme Court, that go before any of the federal courts, and just take that because these principles are even fundamental at the state level. What happens in the state courts? Because remember, the states are constitutional as well. Okay? We are independent republics with our own constitutions. So the fundamentals of even interpreting our state constitutions is no different than what it then becomes at the federal level. So he continues on. Much of the difficulty which has arisen in all public discussions on this subject, that being how to interpret the Constitution, has had its origins in the want of some uniform rules of interpretation expressly or tactically agreed on by disputants. Very different doctrines on this point have been adopted by different commentators, and not unfrequently very different language held by the same parties at different periods. That's no different than what we're seeing. Even worse today, because we've had the injection of socialism and communism in those that are sitting as justices. Okay? So boy, when you talk about the doctrines and you talk about language differences, and even held by some of the same parties within the Republicans, hello? Okay, so here it is. In short, the rules of interpretation have often been shifted to suit the emergency. Hey, let's find a problem. Now, let's sue for it. Oh, Supreme Court. Oh, here's the fix. Interesting. So here's what Story said. In short, the rules of interpretation have often been shifted to suit the emergency and the passions and prejudices of the day, or the favor and odium of a particular measure. Gun control, abortion, LGBTQ, whatever, transgenderism, the passions and prejudices of the day, or the favor and odium of a particular measure, have not unfrequently furnished a mode of argument which would, on one hand, leave the Constitution crippled and inanimate, or on the other hand, give it an extent and elasticity subversive of all rational boundaries. Boy, can we expound on that? How much time do we have, Kath? We got a little over 5 years to expound on that, so I'm glad. Probably going to run out of storage space on the camera's little storage gitchy-goomy in there before those 5 years are up. But hey, 5 minutes. I'm sorry, she said 5 minutes. Well, I just took you through a gitchy-goomy in the last 30 seconds. So the idea that he talks about here is endeavoring to ascertain what are the true rules of interpretation applicable to the Constitution. How do you fix a standard which you measure its powers and its limits, its prohibitions, and guard its obligation and enforce its securities of our rights and liberties? Boy, when you take into consideration all that I prefaced in that opening paragraph and what I stated in paragraph 178, that this paragraph 180 becomes almost overwhelming. It is a life study, and that's why a federal judge, a justice on the Supreme Court in particular, needs to have the wisdom, needs to have the understanding, needs to get into the historical context of what this Constitution is all about. Now, I will say that in here, Justice Story says that the Constitution is supposed to be for perpetuity. And it is not what the Democrats, it is not that elasticity, because when you have that, it leads to the subversion of our rights and our liberties. And we're seeing that. We've seen that in previous courts where it was prevailed with the liberal justices. We're seeing that in all of the other federal courts at the lower levels, even at the appellate level, where our liberties are definitely put in a precarious place because of the judgments rendered. So one of the things that he goes in, we're only in section 181, I, or 1, is that the first and fundamental rule in the interpretation of all instruments is to construe them according to the sense of the terms and the intentions of the parties. I've read Blackstone. I have Blackstone's commentaries on the English law. I go back and I reference those as much as I reference Calvin or some of the others in various areas of biblical studies as well. But Mr. Justice Blackstone has remarked that the intention of a law is to be gathered from the words, the context, the subject matter, the effects, and the consequences, or the reason and the spirit of the law. He goes on to justify the remarks by stating that words are generally to be understood in their usual and most known signification, not so much regarding the proprietary of grammar as their general and popular use, that if words happen to be dubious, their meaning may be established by the context or by the comparing them with other words and sentences in the same instrument, that illustrations may be further derived from the subject matter which reference to which the expressions are used, that the effect and consequences of a particular construction is to be examined, because if a literal meaning would involve a manifest absurdity, it ought not to be adopted, and that the reason and spirit of the law, or the causes which led to its enactment, are often the best exponents of the words and limit their application. Now, there's so much that has happened in our modern times in respect to this, but because we do not understand those mirrors in history, we do not understand the context, and worse of all, we do not understand the words and meanings of those words in the dictionary of the founding. Boy, we're all messed up today. That's the basis of it right there, is we don't go back to the fundamentals. We don't go back to the fundamentals of our biblical truth and understanding God's laws, the fundamentals and establishment of all law for the good of the people, for justice, and for our happiness. Constitutionalism is the same thing. Constitutionalism is for justice, our society, our happiness, our protection, and that we would be able to come back next week because Sam Adams, he got it right. And those anti-federalists, they nailed